Dr. Harcombe, part of the evidence before this committee is a journal article that was entitled Low Carbohydrate versus Isoenergetic Balanced Diets for Reducing Weight and Cardiovascular Disease or Cardiovascular Disease Risk, a systematic review and meta-analysis, and the chief author of that article was a Professor Nodia. And the contention in the article, or the conclusion of the article, is that when one compares the low carbohydrate and the isoenergetic diet for reducing weight and cardiovascular risk, the two diets were almost the same in terms of the results. So, Dr. Harcombe, you conducted a review of that article and a critique of that article. Can you tell Madam Chair about that, please?
Thank you, Dr. Just tell us where are you? What page?
Madam Chair, I read that from page 60 of the bundle initially, and now we're going to move on to the presentation itself. That was just by way of introduction, Madam Chair. So now we are on we're into the meat of the matter, Madam Chair. It's page 97 of the same bundle that we were busy with before the break.
Thank you, Dr. Ramadas. So I wanted to go through in this presentation the impact of the paper, the main conclusion, the errors made, and a meta-analysis that has been undertaken without those errors, summary, and then the references for this particular paper are at the end of this presentation in your bundle, Madam Chair. To start with the impact of the paper. Headlines were seen in South Africa, for example this one in July 2014 in Women's Health, low carb diets not better than balanced eating. And the statement that was presented in one of the press releases was that when the amount of energy consumed by people following the low carb and balanced diets was similar, there was no difference in weight loss after 3 to 6 months. And that was a quotation from the lead researcher, Nodia. Here's another headline showing the real meal revolution. New research could debunk Banting diet. Based on the current evidence, we cannot recommend a low carbohydrate diet to the public. That quotation was from the Chief Executive of the Heart and Stroke Foundation of South Africa. And the reference in that particular article was to celebrity professor Tim Noakes. An article in the Cape Town Times in July 2014, Noakes' low carbohydrate diet not healthier. Some weight loss diets widely promoted through the media was a quotation from Nodia et al. And celebrity Professor Tim Noakes was again mentioned. We have an article here from Health 24, Tim Noakes to face inquiry over Banting tweet. The paper clearly had a high impact in the local media and clearly was directed towards Professor Tim Noakes, and it has emerged during this hearing that this has been an important paper seen by the pro forma complainant in the case against Professor Noakes. And the main conclusion of that paper was, in non-diabetic participants, our analysis showed little or no difference in mean weight loss in the two groups at 6 months. And the two groups were a lower carbohydrate diet and a so-called balanced diet. Another quotation from the paper, some weight loss diets widely promoted through the media recommend a regimen greatly restricting carbohydrates. The study could not judge genuine low carbohydrate diets as it did not study them. The average intake across the 14 studies with which we're going to become very familiar over the next few minutes, the average intake was 35% carbohydrate, 35% fat, and 30% protein. That is in no way what people would call a low carbohydrate diet if they were trying to study it in comparison with a more balanced diet. Indeed, Madam Chair, that looks like a remarkably balanced diet to me, 35, 35, 30, and that is supposed to represent the low carbohydrate diet. And a particular benefit of a low carbohydrate diet is that it is satisfying to the hunger. It delivers the nutrients that humans need. So it is known for having a satiety effect, in contrast to the low energy and the hunger that people feel on low calorie diets. And the study set isocaloric as a criterion. And what that meant is when it was looking at a so-called balanced diet and when it was looking at a lower carbohydrate diet, it made sure that the calories in both of those diets were the same. So it negated the satiety advantage that low carbohydrate diets have, and perhaps even lower carbohydrate diets have. And there was a statement in the introduction to the paper, and this is a direct quotation: to achieve the very low carbohydrate these diets prescribe restriction of most vegetables and fruit. Now that only occurs at the therapeutic level of the low carbohydrate diet, where perhaps carbohydrates are kept to 5% of dietary intake. So the authors have shown that they understand what a genuine low carbohydrate diet is, and yet they go on to study lower carbohydrate diets and condemn Bantim. When I was asked to take a look at this paper, as it had become so material to this hearing, I started off by looking, as I would do with any paper, for how the conclusions were reached. And as I've shown with what I've done with my thesis and also with the 7-country study, I go back to extract the data originally myself so that I can understand where the authors have got to. In that data extraction, I observed a number of errors. We start with the inclusion criteria, and authors of a paper have an advantage in that they can set inclusion criteria. Randomized controlled trials, very wise, published in English, completely acceptable, more than 10 participants in each group, not multifactorial, so no other exercise or stop smoking or any other intervention to muddy the waters. This is one that was unhelpful from the outset to the lower carbohydrate diet. It's not unreasonable to set it, but it should be noted that it acts to the disadvantage of the lower carbohydrate diet from the offset. Complete macronutrient information needed to be available, of course, follow-up of 12 weeks or longer, and the controlled diet, the balanced diet, was defined by the authors as any diet that covered the ranges of 45 to 65% carbohydrate, 25 to 35% fat, and 10 to 20% of total energy from protein. So those were the studies that were being examined. Immediately I observed that 4 of the 14 studies included failed the inclusion criteria set by the authors. There were 2 studies by DeLuy et al., one from 2009 and one from 2012, and the 2009 report did not have data conducive to meta-analysis. We will see when we turn to the DeLuy study that it was quite obvious from the table extracted by Nordea that that should have been obviously not able to be included. Keogh et al. Failed the stipulation set by the authors that fat should provide 25 to 35% of the balanced diet. We will see in a moment the fat content that it did contain. One study was a duplicate of another study, so there was a duplication of studies included. One of them should have been excluded, and the Luscombe study reported on fewer participants. It would therefore make sense for that to be the one excluded. And another study failed the stipulation that fat should provide 25 to 35% of the balanced diet. The fat intake in SACS was in fact 20% of the intervention. We're now going to go through these 14 studies because they have been used to make the conclusion that was so widely publicised in South Africa and so closely connected to the work of Professor Tim Noakes. So the first paper from 2004, National Cholesterol Education Programme Diet, was a diet lower in carbohydrates and higher in protein and monounsaturated fat. And one of the key findings of this paper was that weight loss was significantly greater in the modified low carbohydrate diet than in the National Cholesterol Education Programme diet. So a weight loss difference of 13.6 pounds to 7.5 pounds. So the errors that were observed in the extraction of data from Ord et al., the diet comprised carbohydrate, fat and protein proportions of 10, 62 and 28 for 2 weeks, then 27, 43 and 30% for 2 weeks, and then 28, 39 and 33 for 8 weeks. Nordea and colleagues reported the final 8 weeks as the 12-week diet composition, which was not entirely accurate. Calorie intake was reported by the team as 1,300 kilocalories for women and 1,600 calories for men, and the range which was converted by the authors did not clarify the gender differentials. These are small errors at this stage, Madam Chair, but when there is a material error, I will indicate it. So we move to the first of the DeLuy studies, and it's important to note that these studies were not necessarily observing low carbohydrate diets and low fat diets in an isocaloric environment. So the aim of this study was to compare the effect of 2 diets on something quite other, on circulating GLP-1 levels and the relation with insulin response after weight loss. So this study sought to achieve weight loss and then examine the glucagon-like peptide factor in terms of what has happened following that weight loss. So we have the first material error in that this 2009 paper should not have been included as it did not have data conducive to meta-analysis. The average weight loss can be calculated from the table, but the standard deviations or standard errors cannot. And as a result, this study cannot be included in meta-analysis. I will show you in just a moment, Madam Chair, what was actually done with this study to enable it to be included. This material error favoured the balanced control diet. This was another material error, the use of end value data for body weight and not weight loss in the 2 studies was, and the only word I can use here, absurd, and this favoured the control diet. And this next slide will show what I mean. So this is a figure extracted from the Nordea et al. Paper, and it's figure 3 in that paper. And a lay person would be able to look at the averages. If we're looking at the column here for the average loss under the low carbohydrate diet and the average loss under the balanced diet, and we've got weight loss amounts of 6.2, 7.2, 5.7, 2.65, and then these 2 numbers stand out as being quite incongruent, where we have 90.4, 91.4, and then in the balanced diet 87.5 and 88. That was in fact the end weight of the participants on average in these studies. So every other measure looked at weight loss, and these 2 studies presented the end weight. Now the end weight tells us nothing about the starting weight. The starting weight could have been dramatically different. The starting weight for the lower carbohydrate group was indeed higher than it was in the balanced diet. So there was a disadvantage to start with, but you simply cannot take end body weight data and compare it to a table with all the other measures in weight loss. So my summary of this is a lay glance at this table shows that the 2 DeLuy studies are quite incongruent. I'll put where there's a material error at the front of the point. The calories are slightly incorrect. The actual paper reported 1,507 calories in the diet group and 1,500 calories in the control group, and the conversion was slightly miscalculated, and the slight differential was presented the wrong way round in the tables in the Nordea et al. Paper. So we turn to the second DeLuy study in 2012, and we can see from the title alone that again it's evaluating certain measures within the body that have nothing to do with low carbohydrate diets or balanced diets in obese subjects. It's particularly interested in a gene variant. Our aim was to evaluate weight loss and adipocytine levels after 2 hypercaloric diets with different macronutrient distribution in obese subjects with this particular gene variant. Now, it's perfectly reasonable to find a paper that is looking to study something else and to use it in a study of other diets, but its primary aim is not comparing the low carbohydrate diet and a balanced diet. And then we have the material error, which again is using the end value data for body weight, not weight loss, in the two studies. Although when I went back to the original paper, you can actually get average weight loss and standard deviations in the narrative of this 2012 paper, which is why this one can be included in meta-analysis. But this error favoured again the control balanced diet. The calories again were slightly incorrect, but this time they were the right way round. We move to the Farnsworth paper, the effect of high protein, energy-restricted diets on body composition, glycemic control, and lipid concentrations in overweight and obese, hyperinsulinic men and women. And the title itself is showing that it's actually not comparing lower carbohydrate diets and lower fat diets. It's particularly interested in high protein. And its conclusion was that replacing carbohydrate with protein from meat, poultry, and dairy foods has beneficial metabolic effects and no adverse effects on markers of bone turnover or calcium excretion. So there's some quite particular conclusions coming from these particular papers. A material error, the weight loss in the control diet intervention was reported by the authors as 7.95 kilogram rather than the 7.9 kilogram reported in the paper. That favoured marginally the control diet. And the paper reported weight loss as 7.8 kilograms with a standard error of 0.7 and 7.9 with a standard error of 0.6 for the diet and control groups respectively. Standard deviations were 3.7 and 3.2. So where standard error information was given, I converted it to standard deviations, as indeed did the authors on a number of occasions. It is not known how the authors obtained their standard deviations of 3.5 and 2.45 respectively. In Farnsworth's paper, the macronutrient compositions differed. In the abstract and the text, the carbohydrate, fat and protein measures were given as 44, 29 and 27 in the diet group and 57, 27, 16 in the control group. And in the text, they were given as 40, 30, 30, carbohydrate, fat, protein, and 55, 30, 15 in the diet and control groups respectively. And these were the values extracted by Nordea and colleagues. The diet was 12 weeks and 4 weeks maintenance, not the 16 weeks that was represented in their tables. Sorry, I jumped ahead. We move now to the Frisch et al. Paper from 2009, a randomized control trial on the efficacy of carbohydrate-reduced or fat-reduced diets in patients attending a telemedically guided weight loss program. And a major conclusion from this paper was that weight loss was 5.8 kilograms in the low carbohydrate group and 4.3 kilograms in the low fat group. The carbohydrate reduced diet was more beneficial with respect to cardiovascular risk factors compared to the fat reduced diet. The errors made in Frisch and colleagues, a material error, was that the number of completers were taken from a later time than weight loss. In any dietary study, it's inevitable that people drop out along the way. People do find it difficult to stick to diets even when they're involved in a clinical trial. If you take the completers later on in the study, they will be fewer in number than those earlier on in the study. As this particular study favoured the lower carbohydrate diet, this resulted in lower weighting for that study in meta-analysis. This disadvantaged the pooled effect for the lower carbohydrate diets and then again favoured the control diet. So to give an example, because this error does come up a couple more times, the authors extracted data for completers at 12 months and extracted the weight loss data at 6 months. The number of completers should have been 95 in the diet group and 89 in the control group, respectively at the time the weight loss data were extracted, and not 85 and 80 respectively. That gives that particular study, if you remember those forest plot diagrams, that gives this particular study less weighting and makes it more likely that the control diet will do better. So this is the KEO study from 2007, the effects of weight loss on a low carbohydrate diet on flow-mediated dilation, adhesion molecules and adiponectin. The title in itself again confirms this is not a study looking at low-fat versus low-carbohydrate diets, although that data were available within the narrative. And a conclusion of this paper was, in summary, weight loss does not improve flow-mediated dilation. So these authors were interested in, by whatever means one achieves weight loss, does it impact flow-mediated dilation? And they concluded that it did not. A material error with this study is that it should not have been included. It failed the inclusion criteria set by the authors that fat should provide 25 to 35% of the energy in a balanced diet. The fat level in this particular study was in fact 20%. And materially, notwithstanding the fact that it should have been excluded, the number of completers again were taken from a later time than the weight loss. As this study favoured the lower carbohydrate diet, this resulted in lower weighting in meta-analysis. Again, this disadvantaged the pool effect for lower carbohydrate diets and favoured the control diet. Now, the reason for going to the second error, even though this should have been excluded, will become clear when we rerun the meta-analysis. And it's a small matter of detail, but there were a number of what I would call sloppy data extractions. The date was incorrect in a number of tables and correct in others. So the study was from 2007. So the Clemsdale paper from 2010 was studying the effects of a low glycemic load diet versus a low-fat diet in subjects with and without the metabolic syndrome. And the study aim was to compare what they called the low glycemic load diet with a low-fat diet in subjects with that syndrome, and their conclusion was that the low glycemic diet appeared more suitable for subjects with metabolic syndrome. Now, as I drew out in my presentation this morning, Madam Chair, the conclusions of studies are very important to take into account, and if you're reporting meta-analysis on a number of studies, it's important and balanced to include the conclusions of those studies so that the readers of one's article can see for themselves what the author's own conclusions were, and then you've taken the pooled data and put it all together.